Yet the story of Croesus has another twist. Having lost a battle to the redoubtable Persian king Cyrus, he was about to be burned alive when he called Solon's name and shouted something like, "Solon, you were right." Again, this is all legend. Cyrus asked about the nature of such unusual invocations, and he told him about Solon's warning. This impressed Cyrus so much that he decided to spare Croesus' life, as he reflected on the possibilities as far as his own fate was concerned. People were thoughtful at that time. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Fooled by Randomness.
And in Fooled by Randomness, Taleb also says, ask a profitable investor to explain the reasons for his success. He will offer some deep and convincing interpretation of the results. Frequently, these delusions are intentional and deserve to bear the name charlatanism. Now, in our space, the VC investing and startup space, if one wants to sort of spot charlatanism or prevent charlatanism, or even more importantly, not be one of these cliche profitable investors who is blind to the reasons for their own success, and generally you want to apply Lindy ideas to business and life, then one should be going to rationalvc.com and just typing in their email to subscribe, because not only will you get early access to the podcasts, but more importantly, a summary of all the learnings from the episode in a summarized email, plus other exclusive content, all for free. So that's that. And this book, what do you have to say about this book?
I'm very conflicted with this book, is probably the right way to put it. It's a very complex, very detailed book that you need to study, which for short-term thinkers that exist today and people that only go on TikTok for 10 seconds, I think is going to be a rewiring of their brain. That's one side of me. The other side of me is there is so much in this book, in particular if you don't know Taleb, the author, that is new, interesting, and fresh. But having said that, obviously there's the other side, which is like, he is such a complex, like his writing is so complex to follow. So you need to put the time and effort in to study it. But having said all of that, brilliant book. And we love Taleb. Why do we love Taleb?
So before I get into all of this, last night we had a huge Mediterranean grill and I had meat sweats. I couldn't sleep properly, partially in excitement for this episode as well, because on episode 49, which was actually a few months ago now, we explained the Rational VC pivot and rebrand, whereby we're no longer bringing on guests. We're not going to go into the reasons why here. Please go back to episode 49 to listen, but it is about producing timeless content rather than the Silicon, or as we say, Silicon Valley circle jerk of just interviewing people when a few months later, like realistically, who's going to go?
The charlatans.
Yeah, realistically, who's going to go and listen to that episode a year or 2 years from now? Very few people. Whereas Taleb's books, the Incerto series, it was even Naval Ravikant said, these are books you'll be reading 1,000 years from now. They're books that you just keep rereading. And so these books, the two bodies of work by two people that are foundational to our brand, that are the reason for much of our brand, that formed our brand, the ideas and philosophies of Taleb's Incerto series and Poor Charlie's Almanac, which was, of course, put together by Peter Kaufman, and rest in peace to Charlie Munger, who very recently passed away. And these books are foundational to our brand. So the episode 50, which is this, for the next few episodes is going to be Incerto series, then Poor Charlie's Almanac. Then the following episodes will be doing other Lindy books, on and on, hopefully forever, because this is our life's work. And regardless of what complications life throws at us, we still continue to focus on making this life's work in the long term. So the only thing I will say, we want to caveat with, these books are so important to us that every, 50 or 100 episodes or whatever, we'll redo these episodes again and again, because with new and improved understanding, new perspective on life, maturing, essentially life goes on, and we'll keep rereading and redoing these episodes on Inserto and Portales Almanac.
Yeah, interpretation changes over time, and so it's interesting to go and read. Like, who is it? Was it Naval that says only pick a few books and read them over and over? I think that's the case with what we're going to be doing, insofar as we think we'll bring different interpretations based on what we're learning in life.
Yes, and like 10 years ago, I was essentially fraud because I was going into banking, charlatanism, and I didn't really have much of a clue. I hadn't read this stuff yet, and the reason I obsess over this stuff so much is because having grown up in I'm an immigrant, but having grown up in an environment which this type of knowledge was not even known. I mean, even in today's world, in the Western world, it's not really known. It's among the minority who seek such knowledge. So, yeah, I mean, it's foundational. It's super important. And it's basically a clueless immigrant who stumbled upon this work, still continues to read it and absorb it. And the only thing before we get into it now for real is that we'll caveat with saying, this is not a book review. These episodes are not book reviews. We know that Professor Taleb actually hates book reviews, but this is just, as the show notes says, the description of Rational VC now says, every episode we read a Lindy book and find ideas that you can apply to business and life, whether this is in the VC startup space or general business, but more importantly, life as well, because a lot of our prior episodes, even with guests, we were bringing on authors who are writing, like Luke Burgess or many other authors. Eric Jorgensen, who put together the Almanac of Naval Ravikant, and several other authors. So we're bringing on people who have all these interesting ideas, and end of the day, we were already kind of doing this, applying knowledge from books to business and life. And so now it's just the two of us. Very rarely we'll bring on a guest, if it's their book or if it's a book they've been, preaching about. But let's get into it. How do you want to start this episode on Fooled by Randomness?
Well, after all your caveats, start by answering my question, which you haven't done, which is, why do you love Taleb?
I think in simple terms, in a world of charlatanism, especially in the VC and startup world.
In a low interest rate environment.
In a ZERP environment, it's a necessity. This is, as you said, it's not a book to read. These are not books to read, the Inserto series. They are books to study. And every time I reread, I get new and improved understanding. I still think I know nothing, because as a classic saying goes, the more you read or the more you learn, the more you realize that you really know jack shit. So his ideas are required reading for life. I mean, I can't imagine a life of, whenever anyone says, what are you, I'm just like, just reread these books. Reread Inserto and Portales Almanac 50 times. And if you read anything, if you could only read a few things. So it helps you improve your decision making. It helps you spot bullshit in a world of bullshit. The more and more, I mean, the two of us now, every time we're scrolling Twitter, we have like this Twitter group DM chat with our friend as well, and we just keep sending to Twitter DMs tweets that we see, and we just put FBR, which of course Fooled by Randomness, but not Fatboy Raves, which was it was a party company I started in my teens, but which was actually very profitable, cash in hand.
No tax jokes.
But I didn't speak.
Wait, but hold on. I agree with everything you've said. The principles are interesting, all of that stuff. But actually, what is it specifically about Taleb as a person? Because what you hear
authenticity, which is what our brand's three values. If you listen to the intro of this and you went to rationalvc.com, you will see our long-standing three core values of our brand since day one we started, which is authenticity, truth-seeking, and long-termism. And he is as authentic as they come. And he spots other authentic people as well, which is when Charlie Munger passed recently. Taleb tweeted, he said, rest in something along the lines of rest in peace, Munger, one of the very last few authentics. And so Munger, Taleb, why we pull to the ideas of such people? Because not only are their ideas phenomenal in the sea of bullshit, but they're also extremely authentic. They're saying what others don't want to say, or they're thinking, or what others haven't even thought about. So that's why it's foundational to our brand.
So the reason I think that as an author, this Taleb is really interesting, is because if you're listening to this and not watching, Cyrus is opening a
kombucha, Californian, I believe.
No plugs, unless we get the check in the mail. The interesting thing about Taleb as an author is, like I said earlier, he's very hard to follow, but that's only if you don't know him. So I think if you try to understand him, maybe through following him on Twitter or watching his videos, he very rarely does that many interviews, but where he does interviews, they're very interesting. You'll realize that the way this guy's brain works is just so counterintuitive, or countercultural, I should say. And that's why he's so iconoclastic, as it says at the back of the book. But what I really like about him is that there's this authenticity point, but it's public authenticity. He holds himself accountable to his own beliefs.
Skin in the game.
He's got significant skin in the game, which is the name of one of his other books as part of the Incerto series. Now, we're talking about Fooled by Randomness, the hidden role of chance in life and in the markets, which is, I believe, his first book in the Incerto series.
Yes.
He explains in the book, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, that while he's doing his studying for this book, he then goes off into a tangent around black swans midway through writing this book, goes away and I think writes The Black Swan or some of the parts of Black Swan, and then comes back and writes Fooled by Randomness. So, and then he releases Fooled by Randomness first, and I think Black Swan second. The interesting thing about that is he's holding himself accountable to his knowledge path and sample paths, which is something we'll come to in a bit, around what he believes and finds interesting. And therefore he follows that passion. And, this is very close to something that Take a Shot Naval talks about a lot. Naval Ravikant being a prominent angel investor, angel philosopher, as he likes to term himself, or others term him, in Silicon Valley. And Naval says, don't pick up a book and read it because you've been told to read that book. Have a look through the book. If you like the first few passages, keep reading it. If you find it interesting, keep reading it. If you don't, put it to the side. Find something you find interesting at that point and read it. So anyway, the point I'm trying to raise is he's authentic to himself, both publicly and privately. And I think that's what the really interesting thing is. Now, moving on from the author specifically, unless you have anything else you want to say about Taleb.
As Manga says, nothing to add.
Rest in peace. Moving on from that, what we're going to do, I think the structure of this podcast is we're going to deep dive into parts of the podcast that we find, parts of the book, I should say, that we find interesting, and stuff that we think applies to, as you say, business, life, markets, whatever. But actually what we want to do to start with is maybe give a quick overview of the core concepts that Taleb raises in this book. And then once we've kind of established what the core concepts of this book are, and broadly, a lot of these are cross-cutting and fit into his other books as well across the Incerto series. What are the core concepts? And then we can build on, maybe going chapter by chapter or going quote by quote, or thinking about, authentically, what do we think of the book?
This is a tough book to go chapter by chapter because, as with most of Taleb's work, as you said, even book by book, there's no specific rule of like you have to start with Fooled by Randomness and go in this order. When you ask anyone who's attended Taleb's Real World Risk Institute, who are like the true Incerto nerds among us, I'm actually planning on attending RWRI, but even if you ask those guys, they will tell you they all have different opinions on which order to read the books in, or they're like it doesn't matter, or so, because so it's not a book necessarily, or body of work to read in order of books or specifically in order of chapters. But we'll start with some of the key ideas, and then just as we've done a lot of podcasts in the past where, for example, you and I, let's say, for example, we riffed on a Luke Burgess blog post on epsilon theory, on it was called 25 anti-mimetic
principles for a countercultural life.
For living a countercultural life. And the way we did those, we discussed the principles, and then we discussed principles, and then we discussed how our own personal life. Iman likes to troll me sometimes, but
sometimes, all the time,
because of course,
it's the immigrant accent.
When you're a South Iranian from Shiraz, the capital of the old Achaemenid Persian Empire, you're a king of kings, and so one is of course anyway. And actually, before we even get into the podcast, what do you have for us here? You have here books of Epic Iran, You obviously have the Inserto series. We have a cigar collection, Habanos Cuban cigars. You have Cohiba. You have what else do you have here?
We've got some Partagas shorts, which are actually delicious if you ever want a short smoke. There's Trinidad Reyes. Trinidad, in my opinion, is the best brand that comes out of Cuba. It's much better than Cohiba in terms of taste and bitterness and just generally what I like from a cigar. But, you know, being from Cuba, the quality control, particularly for Trinidad.
Oh, it's interesting you mentioned quality control now, because when we're all together and I mention quality control, I say, this one's a dud.
No, your one wasn't a dud. You just don't know how to smoke cigars. Trinidad.
Strictly Davidoff cigars, by the way, because Davidoff goes through Swiss quality control, elite, whereas Cubans, 7 out of a box of 25 are duds due to poor quality control. But please continue.
I don't think I've ever had a dud. But anyway, getting back to
Full by randomness.
For those listening and not watching, Cyrus is pointing to a series of books that we have between us and some boxes of cigars that I've enjoyed over the years. But the big box is Cohiba Esplendidos, which is one of the great cigars that comes out of Cuba. But anyway, what were you talking about before you went on an
what was I talking
tirade?
about? This is a long episode, so we're going to get into a lot of ideas.
So okay, why don't you maybe give an overview of randomness and luck, and then I can get into hindsight bias, survivorship bias, that are some of the core concepts.
And what I was saying with the example of the Luke Burgess blog post episode we did, or many other episodes, where it's the two of us, we just riff and apply. We bring up stories of our own life and relate it to what we've read, and also just generally discuss the ideas. So how can we plan this for the future? How can we apply this to the future? Because we're building here a media company, but also we do investing on the side as part of Rational.Fund, part of the Rational VC brand, where we invest in syndicates. We had soft commitments to start a fund. We didn't. We chose not to because it was a ZERP, and now every fund manager is struggling to raise fund 2. So we're focusing on long-term decision making, being operators and investing on the side. And so, yeah, basically this is. I don't even know where I'm going.
It's interesting you raise this. It sparks something in my head. So, talk about what randomness and luck is, but specifically, you feel a little bit vindicated when you read this book after having seen what happens in venture capital land and in startup land over the last, particularly, post-COVID to 2022,
yes.
That 2-year period or 1.5 year period, where things went crazy and you don't really understand you don't really understand the core principles of why it was, problematic around having such a, excessive culture of funding and money that existed in the space.
I mean, this is what.
But once you read this book, and I would argue actually once you read things like Skin in the Game and Anti-Fragile particularly, which are further down the line of the books in his Inserto series, you really at that point understand why he calls David Sacks a techno watermelon.
Indeed. So a lot of, we kickstart. You go back to episode 1 we did in 2020, and we were calling out a lot of the BS. The name Rational VC is itself an oxymoron, but at the same time, we were trying to bring some sense of, rationality, some sense of anything. Semblance is the word. Some sense of semblance in apologies, because I've actually spent the last few months in Germany, and so my English is, it was already at immigrant levels, but now it's fucking destroyed.
Can I just a little pause there? He knew I was going to troll him about that, so he that's a preemptive, he stopped me from trolling him.
Fun fact is, because long story short, but unfortunately, I've known you for like 26 years now, 27 years.
Kill me.
We met in the Saturday Persian School in London in the playground in 1997, October 98 to be precise.
Shucks.
Because I arrived in England in October 97. And so...
my life went downhill.
Your life did go downhill. And... There's so many. It always happens. There's so many interruptions, and I have 50 ideas in my head. I forget what I'm trying to say.
You're not stoic in the Talebian sense.
Sure. So the point I was trying to say is that we both attended Persian school, Saturday Persian school. We studied every Saturday for 13 years, up until pre-university level, age 18, which we call A-levels in England. It's officially recognised by the British examination boards, Persian language A-level, and I think it was year 12, which is 2 years before university, I got the highest grade in Persian language A-level in the country. Then year 13, you got the highest grade in Persian language A-level in the country. So we were back to back. And so we were, of course, very good at Persian language. But as we were discussing, my English is deteriorated because 1, I've been coding more, and 2, I've been in Germany. But alas, we continue. So
get to the point.
Get to the point. Chapter 1.
No, forget chapter 1. Can you explain just
randomness and luck? So
just randomness and luck.
The impact of randomness and luck on success, which is essentially people often underestimate the role of chance in their achievements. This is every day, more and more, every day that passes, it pisses me off to scroll Twitter, but even more so LinkedIn, especially because we're so plugged in and connected to everyone in the VC, tech, startup investing scene. And the circle jerk of, a fundraising has happened. People are still, we know founders, many people watching this know founders who are still talking about a fundraise a year ago. And can you believe, we went from nothing to fundraising X $million, where really that's a fiduciary duty. It's not a great achievement. Number 2, right place, right time, for example, because you're in a basically ZIRP, zero interest rate phenomenon, the market that we were in. And another example, people call me and say, okay, you transitioned, you had business background, Cyrus, you became technical, you did all the coding stuff. And then they say, I plan to attend a boot camp. And, what about attending a boot camp? And then I can get a FANG job. And I tell them, my dear friend, just like a startup's raising X $1 million in 2-3 years ago, you getting a FANG job after attending a boot camp or even a university on a conversion course is extremely slim, because the last few years, this was, of course, timing. It was affected by timing. So Taleb talks about mild success can be explainable by skill, while success is attributable by variance, which is, this also goes back to the notion of, we always discuss asymmetric bets, why one should be placing asymmetric bets, which shout out to Daniel Vassallo and Louis, who run this small bets community, which is applying such ideas to a lot of business building, because in the startup world, a lot of people will be, again, mentioning X million fundraised, and then they'll show off of, we have 40 employees as if that's a measure of success. And within 3 years, we've known several of these startups. Within a few years, they close down or they fire half the team. Sahil Lavingia has documented this in his book, The Minimalist Entrepreneur, where he talks about how he went through this whole Silicon Valley process, and now he just runs such a nice, clean operation, which is anti-Silicon Valley model. And so the point we're trying to get at is, if you're raising X million and blah, blah million, and you're trying to say, okay, this company did this, we should follow exactly what they did. Or the founder of Hopin did this, and he sold his secondary shares for 100 million.
Shots fired.
Or the founders of Pipe, somehow, Pipe.com, which was the business. A lot of it, there's several business. We could mention 20 such startups, which during 2020 to 2021, 2022.
My guy, you're ruining our pipeline.
We're ruining our pipeline, but, skin in the game, authenticity.
Hold yourself accountable.
I'd rather, we say shit as it is. So a lot of these startups, you tell me, because Taleb also talks about lucky fools benefit from disproportionate luck, but attribute their success to non-random reasons.
Correct. And
Kapil Gupta, MD, at Siddha Performance, who's actually Naval's personal advisor.
How do you spell Siddha? It's just
SIDDHA, Siddha Performance. You can check him out. Check out some of his videos. I think he's done an episode with Naval on a podcast. Point being, Siddha calls out how his book Direct Truth is actually phenomenal. Go and read that. But he calls out so much of the BS in today's world, and in terms of how they're all prescriptions. Everything's a fucking prescription. You go on LinkedIn. I raised 3 million last year. So here are the top 10 tips I have for if you're trying to raise 10 million. You, my friend, firstly, anyone else trying to raise X million, their business, everything is different from yours. But even then, let's say the business model is the same, their level of skill, everything is the same, the team. Let's say we just photocopy, we had a machine that photocopies them, and you have the result copy and pasted. Even then, they will struggle to achieve the same results. They may actually have better results, they may have worse results. Why? Because there are infinite random variables in play that are completely out of our control.
So let me. I think that's a good cover of kind of what the book starts with. Let me jump around a bit.
Sure. This is a jump around book. So
let me jump around to kind of what emerges. So before I do that, there are 3 sections in the book, right? There are 3 sections that I think, how many chapters are there? 18 chapters, 14 chapters, something like that?
I think it's 13 or 14, yes.
So
you have here the hard copy with a lot of sticky notes.
There are 14 chapters in this book. Of those 14 chapters, there are 3 sections. Those 3 sections are the first really chunky bit, which is Solon's warning, which is what we spoke, the first quote that we gave was from that section. The second section is called, I think, Monkeys and Typewriters.
Yes.
The third one is called Wax in My Ears. Really brilliant naming, and he's a brilliant writer because he just talks from the heart. He's very authentic in the way he talks. But anyway, point I'm trying to raise is, in section 1, chapter 3, he starts to talk about what he calls the Monte Carlo effect, right? Or the Monte Carlo accuracy and all this stuff. So by background, Taleb is a trader. Mm-hmm. He trades the markets. What they do is assess risk fundamentally and make bets on the basis of that risk. Now, we'll come on to the skewness issue shortly, which is where he talks about the mathematical side of figuring out what a good bet is. But in the Monte Carlo piece, he talks about how they would run Monte Carlo simulations to understand what good would look like across a range of scenarios for a specific outcome.
And can you explain, again, some people listening may not be super familiar with Monte Carlo, what exactly it is? It's essentially like a model you're running. So you run a model that backdates running. So let's say we backdate X person invested in this startup. Let's say Sequoia invested in, what's one of the fucking millions of companies they invested in? Sequoia invested in, maybe FTX is not a great example, but Sequoia invested in some startup, and this startup turned out to be home run. Or let's use another example. Let's use we're Iranian. We like to reference other Iranians. Let's reference Pejman Nozad of Pear VC. He invested in Dropbox. Arash Ferdowsi, another Iranian, and after a few years, off to the races, business doing well, IPO, etc., yada yada. Now let's assume you run a Monte Carlo model, which is you're backdating, going back to that point in time when he was about to invest, for example, picking that date and then running 1,000 or endless number of different scenarios of what else could have happened and changing or playing with the different variables, inputs. And then you see, actually, that was a 1 in 1,000 chance of that happening, the outcome that he actually obtained. And so then one says, okay, so actually maybe Pejman is not so smart after all. And this is no dig at Pejman whatsoever because, where he's come from, hats off, huge supporters of what he's doing and what he's built. But it's just to say that what are the odds that Pejman Nozad he talks about his story, which people should definitely check out. He's written a blog how he moved from Iran as an immigrant to Silicon Valley. And then in Silicon Valley, he wasn't in Silicon Valley, sorry. He moved from Iran to the US where he was working in a car wash and a yogurt shop. And there's I believe his Twitter cover photo or banner photo is a photo of him sleeping on the floor above this yogurt shop. And he would earn whatever earnings he had. He would then spend on telephone cards to call his high school sweetheart in Iran because he was trying to bring her to America, who's now his wife. And the point is then, being Iranian, an Iranian immigrant, he got to know some other Iranians. He started working in a Persian rug shop. But where was this Persian rug shop located? It was located, I believe, somewhere like a mile down the road from not only Sand Hill Road, but super close to Stanford University. And so he was Iranian. So his deal flow was all the super smart Iranians in Stanford. Mm-hmm. And he was selling rugs to all the ultra wealthy, ultra successful VCs in Silicon Valley, such as Doug Leone, where he would go to their homes and then there's a sense of familiarity and you're getting to know them. And then Doug Leone starts talking shop with him. Pejman says, hey, Doug, I know a whole load of super talented, smart Iranians in Stanford. We could set up a little event. I could bring them. And then, you start doing deals together through the introductions you make, yada, yada, yada. So what are the odds that during a tech boom following the dot-com bust, I think Pejman started doing this in 03, 04, 05, that he was at the right place at the right time with the right clientele, right language skills to access the right deal flow. There's a lot of rights and ifs in this scenario, as you can see. So if you apply a Monte Carlo model, which you backdate and you change any one of these variables among many other variables that we've not even mentioned, the entire outcome would have been different.
So that is accurate, and I think that is a good explanation of what a Monte Carlo simulation is. But why it's relevant here is it's creating alternative sample paths, or an alternative history is what he talks about. So you take all of the potential Pejman Nozards and you test them against each other, and you get to multiple outputs. You see what is the viability of each output, and therefore what is the most likely scenario that emerges. Now there's two things. There's alternative sample paths. So there are invisible histories that didn't happen.
Yep.
And there are random sample paths. So the succession of those random events that led to Pejman Nozard getting in and creating pair VC and whatever. Now, what ends up happening is that you create all of these sort of alternative histories, which means that you have all of these alternative paths. So what? Then he introduces a concept called ergodicity, which is if you have infinite sample paths and infinite time for those sample paths to emerge in, what ends up emerging is singular outcomes. So if you run the experiment long enough, you're going to get to the same conclusions.
Yes.
If you have enough time and you run enough experiments.
In the long run, the lucky would regress to the mean.
Correct. And he gives a quote which is very interesting. He says, "A mistake is not something to be determined after the fact, but in light of information until that point." What he's referring to here is hindsight bias.
Yes.
So before I get into what that is, across this entire book, what Taleb does really well is highlight human inefficiencies, irrationalities, if you will, around our psychology and the way we think. And it's really interesting because when you compare that to the analytical rigor required in a Monte Carlo simulation, you realize how, what's the right word here that's politically correct? How
Political.
how feeble, if you will, humans can be. So anyway, what is hindsight bias is that after the fact, we try to, say that something happened because of X, Y, and Z reasons, when in fact it was just a random sample path.
Yes.
And in certain cases you get ergodicity, but not enough experiments have been run to get to that point.
Yes.
So he basically, the first thing he calls out, particularly in chapter 3, is this point around hindsight bias, and make sure you're aware of when that's emerging. Now, towards the end of the podcast, we'll come to some recommendations that emerge from this. But it reflects a lot of what we say usually, which is the Stoic thinking.
I want to link here because there's basically 1,000 thoughts we're linking at the same time.
I could see it in your eyes.
When you could see me twitching. So a lot of this goes to when Munger said, what do you need to be successful, quote unquote? And his answer was, you need hard work, you need intelligence or skill, in other words, hard work, intelligence, and a lot of luck, which he said he had. And so, to the point you're touching on, the role of luck or randomness, in other words, where we also see a lot of, as Taleb talks about, charlatan economists, and those who are good at predicting the past will think that they are good at predicting the future.
Correct.
Which is the whole hindsight bias thing you're touching on. Economists love to point to the past and then make some BS prediction about the future, which they never speak of. I mean, they probably make thousands of fucking predictions, and they only speak about 5 of them when they turn out to be right. It's the classic case of, on the Twitter bros who say, these are my predictions for what will happen, and then they just tweet a whole lot of bullshit, basically. And then a few years later, if that prediction turns true, they're retweeting it. But they delete or do not retweet the other 1,000 things. A lot of tech Twitter bros are genuinely people in the VC startup space, no different to these economists, no different to these charlatans, that are susceptible to hindsight bias.
That is exactly right. But what's really interesting is, given this point around ergodicity, i.e. if you run the experiment long enough,
yes,
those charlatans will become lucky, right? So this is what's really interesting is, if you devote enough time, and he gives a very interesting example, I'll get to it in a second, to something, and for those random sample paths to emerge and alternative histories to be tested, the lucky regress to the mean.
Yes.
So if you see a mate who's won the lottery,
Yes.
they're lucky in this history. In multiple.
Apologies. Firstly, I wouldn't have mates who play the lottery, but please continue. But if I had, which is another path on its own.
Correct. If there are multiple other, there will probably be millions of other. There are billions of other alternative histories where that person doesn't win and they regress to the mean, so they won't be rich. Now, the example that I was going to come to, when he talks about being lucky and regressing to the mean, it's quite interesting because he talks about time scale quite a lot. So it's funny.
I know it's funny.
It's funny. Timescale is important when judging events. So always have the ability to test over as much time as possible something. The example he gives is he prefers older, I should say, not necessarily old, guys who've been trading for 20, 30, 40, 50 years because he knows that they are less susceptible to being lucky. More experiments have been run with them that have stopped them from blowing up than your really hotshot guy who's been, killing the market in the last 2 years and is actually the highest performing trader of the last century, but he's only been doing it for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And he's like, that's not enough time for me to know if this guy is going to blow up.
I actually wish that the VC industry was more like this old school trading industry, and that if you blow up, you're out. But unfortunately, again, as Munger said recently, the VC industry today is investment banking in disguise, because these fucking VCs are being paid management fees, so that there's not really a risk of blow up. They're just living off management fees.
You know what's funny? I know it's funny. What's funny is even those that could be deemed as charlatans. So, for example,
fire the shots, come on.
No. For example, Taleb shoots his shot at people like the Techno Watermelon.
Yep.
But also his mate Chamath.
Yes.
Even Chamath himself recognizes this
and
calls it out. He even says, VC is bullshit because people are just making money from that and not putting skin in the game themselves.
Despite what Chamath also actually, what people think of him, which may not approve of some of his activities on, dumping on retail investors, whatnot. But one thing that he does get credit for is he acknowledged himself once. He said, I am 1 in 7 billion luck. Like, what are the odds that a kid from Sri Lanka then goes to Canada, then this happens and lands in Silicon Valley, then AOL VP, then Facebook, and he's like, I'm 1 in 7 billion luck. And so he acknowledges that. And unfortunately, not many people in Silicon Valley do.
So this is another point I want to raise. Sorry, I'm jumping around.
This is this book, so it's going to be constant back and forth.
The book is so the second. So we've spoken about randomness and luck as the first point. We've spoken about hindsight bias in the second point, and then the third point, which links into this, is survivorship bias, which is very important here. So survivorship bias is this tendency to focus on successful individuals without considering those who failed due to random factors. So this is the point around alternative sample paths. Mm-hmm. If you go through enough sample paths, the person who is today successful might not have been successful in many other paths.
Yep.
What does that mean? It means that if that person does not acknowledge, unlike Munger, does not acknowledge luck, the role that luck played in their sample path, what you end up with is someone that has survivorship bias and starts to give prescriptions around what the right thing is to do. Now, the second part of the book, the first part was Solon's warning. The second part is the monkeys and typewriters. Brilliant example, because what he says is in the book, if you have infinite monkeys on infinite typewriters, one will produce a work of art. I think he talks about Shakespeare or whatever. And what people then want to do after the fact is attribute value to that monkey for creating that work of art. When it's basically nigh on impossible for that monkey to recreate that work of art as soon as they've created it.
Yes.
So essentially what this is an extreme example of the survivorship bias in action because of human fallibility and
Yes.
the need for us to reason everything in hindsight.
Sure. Related to this, I mean, again, this whole book is jumping around, but to this point that you touched on and the prior one, Taleb actually is known for, I think he's explained a story once that when he joined Wall Street on his first day, someone said, "Hey, come here, kiddo." And they said, "You see that guy over there?" Something along the lines of, "You see that guy over there? It took him 7 years to make $10 million in his book, but then it took him seven seconds to lose it all. Okay, off you go, kiddo." That was the lesson, right? And I think in this book, he also gives the example of, if you can refresh my mind, I believe it's John and Carlos.
Yes.
John and Carlos, who are too fictional, we could say, but a lot of these ideas.
I don't think they're fictional.
They're not fictional, but I suppose he's changed a name in some descriptions, but these are people that he is come across or witnessed a lot of this in Wall Street, and this is stuff that we see. In finance, it's very common, I guess, where a trader would, be up worth. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like John is the flashy guy who always takes a lot of risk in his trading, and he has this huge house. He maybe has a trophy wife. He has this expensive supercar on his driveway, and he keeps taking these huge risks. And then they all scoff at work. They all scoff at poor Carlos because
no. Carlos is the other flamboyant trader, which is the bond trader. The other
what's
one
the
is
name of the
Nero.
Nero. There we go. Sorry. So Nero is the guy who he maybe makes $500,000 a year, not the 10 million or whatever that John makes. And so Nero just makes a measly $500,000, measly we say, and he loses as Taleb's trading strategy was. Nero is more focused on losing a little bit of money every day, but then when the event that has a large variance happens, let's say the market moves significantly that day, he makes money by having placed, bought a call option that day, for example, or something. So his swings, this is how Taleb made his money, which is he lost a little bit of money daily. In exchange, he made a huge sum of money on certain days, which made most of his wealth or his FU money, as some like to say. This is not too dissimilar from, well, now it is different, but this idea, this notion is not too dissimilar from venture capital, which, funnily enough, Taleb mentions venture capital in Fall by Randomness, which is VCs, you make a lot of investments. I mean, at Rational.fund, we make investments among some tier 1 VCs. If you'd like to invest, contact us. But you always got to be pitching.
Yeah, plug.
ABC, always be closing. But we've made investments and we continue to make investments. 90% of these, 80% of these, who knows how many, they're going to go to shit, right? So we're losing a lot. Well, we're losing a little bit relative to how much one of them or two of them could potentially make, which is the whole idea of the power law, which everyone knows. Most of you listening will know how the wins on one, two, or very few make up for the losses of several combined. And so, again, this goes back to the whole asymmetric bets. We've tried to apply a lot of the ideas of asymmetric bets to what we do daily. Like, we're hacking away, building some little software now on the side. And initially we had these grand plans of let's go VC fundraise, let's go do this. And then we just remembered a lot of Taleb's teachings from Fall by Randomness. We also remembered a lot of what Daniel Vassallo preaches, which is an extension of Taleb's ideas applied to tech and software, which is, hey, rather than this circle jerk of big bang fundraise, go and build something which just takes a few days. So your downside is at most you've lost a few days. Your upside is, who knows, could be 6-figure MRR, for instance, like some of Peter Level's businesses, right? So this is the whole asymmetric bet portion of it, combined with the other ideas I said before this as well. So
a couple of things I want to pick up on what you said. So the first thing is, this is why I love his writing. He's called that risk-averse trader that is losing small but trying to win big, Nero.
Nero, yeah. Sorry, that was. Please continue on Nero because I didn't finish that point.
First of all, love the name because obviously Nero is like one of the disastrous, or history has written Nero as being one of the disastrous Roman emperors who was responsible for like the fire of Rome or whatever, and I think Boudicca's rebellion. But and a very short reign. So I think he died at age 30 or something. So number one, love the fact he's called him Nero, even though he's the good guy in the story. And then the second thing is when he talks about Carlos and John, he talks about them in very different ways. So I think John is introduced in chapter 1 or 2.
Yes.
But Carlos is introduced way down the line in later chapters. But he describes them in different ways. So Carlos is this quiet, super well dressed, perfect English Savile Row suit with his Ferragamo tie and his calfskin leather shoes or whatever. But he is seen as an intellectual. He didn't get his PhD, but he was gonna get his PhD kind of guy. And he was very well regarded in the business and was making a lot of money until he fell into the trap of getting into this Russian ruble deal or whatever, and not knowing when to stop his losses. Whereas John is flamboyant in a different way. So John was the pure flamboyant, I know what I'm doing, I'm taking risk, and it's not even risk because I've got stop losses or whatever.
Yeah.
So he's trying to tell you that these types of individuals can come in different formats. You can have the people that think they're super intellectual like the Carlos, or you can have the people that are super flamboyant, which you would maybe associate more naturally with that type of person. Whereas your Neros are actually a little bit more unpolished. They can be ugly, right? So there's this one quote, I'm going to try to find it while you do your thinking. But there was this one quote which I loved in the book, which reminded me of someone very in particular, where he says, what does he say?
To link while you find that, I'll just add a quick little point to what you're saying, which is the scruffy guy is, again, applying this to tech VC. Naval talks about this, we've said before, where he says, when you're being pitched by a startup founder, if they're, let's say, Stanford MBA, polished, their deck is made like they've worked previously in IB or consulting, super polished. Those are the ones that you should actually not fall for and be aware of, but that's usually who the VCs fall for. And Naval says the ones that you should actually be looking further into is, the jittery, scruffy little kid who is stumbling, their words are not straight, there's a lot of filler words, they're trying to get their words together, the deck may be a mess, whatever. Those are the people, the Neros of, let's say, the startup world that you should actually look more into as an opportunity of investment.
True traders, I believe, dress sloppily, are often ugly, and exhibit the intellectual curiosity of someone who would be more interested in the information revealing contents of the garbage can than Cézanne painting on the wall.
BRB, I'm going to go Primark, buy a t-shirt.
Anyway, you told me to remind you of the Nero thing for that reason, right?
That was it. So we wanted to get that point across, and you can kind of see how it's relevant to a lot of the startup. Well, I mean, all of these ideas you apply to whether it's life or startup or VC or whatever, but it's the point that the scruffy guy in the end won. It's the person that everyone scoffed at. It's the guy who lived a modest lifestyle, didn't fall for any, you want to talk about mimetic design now, didn't fall for mimetic traps. And who is doing this today in today's VC world or startup world? If you can name a few people, because when we started our brand, we had these ideas in mind. We said, how can we apply this type of lens to the VC startup investing market? But who else do you know that springs to your mind is doing it the right way? Can you think of any?
So a couple of things.
No, you can't.
No. So number one, your question is loaded because in reality, the nature of venture capital, he does talk about venture capital positively in this book, by the way. The nature of venture capital is that you throw enough darts, but you know that the sample paths are relatively valuable. So you know that one of them or two of them are going to hit. So you go in with your eyes open. Mm-hmm. But the problem is you attract a lot of charlatanism in this space. And so in order to take all those bets and throw all those darts, inevitably you're going to get the fucking FTXs and Binances of the world. You're going to get your SBFs and your CZs. So I don't know.
He spoke positively about VC in this book because, mind you, this was like 20 years ago, and the example of VC.
Is it a 20-year-old book?
Man, it was about 20 years ago, yeah. But recently, he's not been very positive on VC. If you follow Taleb on Twitter, rightfully so, where he calls out a lot of the BS because it's not the game that it used to be. So
this is the techno watermelon point, by the way.
Techno watermelon.
So it's technical, i.e. the person who is the Carlos of the world, who's very intellectual and understands the technical elements of what are being built and all the technology and all of that stuff. But it's a watermelon. Now, my guess of the watermelon is it's filled with water and it's bloated, i.e. it's basically not full of shit. It's very sweet, is what it's full of. By the way, you can get the best watermelons in the world in Iran, Chucks.
You can.
I think that's what he means.
And they're
by
full of seeds, because if they're seedless, they're BS.
Nah, you've taken the analogy too far.
Endocrine disruption potential. Okay, I'm getting woo woo. Let's continue.
All right, let's move on to the following chapters. Some of them are around what he terms skewness. Skewness is where people, in particular, he talks about Harvard professors, people in the fucking trading world, like people that you would expect to be very, very, very learned on the subject, confuse what probability and expectation are, right? So expectation should be your probability multiplied by the payoff. He gives an example. He's in a boardroom and he's talking about what they're talking about what do the markets look like at the minute. And someone asked Taleb, so what is your view on the markets? And he hates this, by the way. He talks about another example where his dad's mate, who's an investor, a super rich guy, comes from Lebanon or London or whatever, takes the Concorde over to New York, has a conversation with him, and he's like, tell me what the markets are going to do. In a sense, testing Taleb to see if he has any information asymmetry on the people that are advising him.
I've had that question one too many times.
And Taleb gives him bullshit answers, says, I don't know, go away. And his dad gets pissed off with him because it's
a very Middle Eastern thing.
Very Middle Eastern.
Where your dad gets
your dad gets a call from the guy saying your son is so rude and whatnot. Anyway. But what the other example is, so when he's in this boardroom and someone asks him what does the market look like, he said, I'm 80% confident the market's going to go up. And then everyone in the room is like, wait, what the fuck? Like, what are you talking about? And he's like, why are you confused? And some random guy just puts up his hand and say, but Professor Taleb, you're shorting the market.
Yeah.
And he says, yeah, the market's, I'm 80% sure the market's going to go up, but I'm shorting it. And everyone's like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Like, am I the idiot here? In fact, what he was signaling at that point is, I'm shorting because even in the 20% of the market goes down, the payoff is fucking massive.
Yes.
So the expectation is better because the payoff multiplied by that probability is higher. But in the scenario the market goes up, it probably goes up 1%. If it goes down 40%, and I'm going to make bucks. So it's that non-linear thinking that is so rare to find, particularly in boardrooms. So rare.
And to add to that point, which is, what's the book called? Is it Chaos Kings?
Yeah.
Put together by Scott Patterson, I think, maybe. Recently put together a book about Taleb and Universa Investments, how they profited, I think something around, they were up 4,000% from trades made during the COVID March 2020 period. And it's insane, the track record that Taleb has had in trading. And again, without much knowledge, you could say that's full by randomness, but I think it's actually much of this is due to the skill and the intelligence here and his understanding of what you just said, which is very rare to come by. What are the odds that someone who understands it so well is profiting continuously from such events?
Well, I don't know is the answer. And I think this book highlights that even myself, you might be tangentially aware of these things, but like realistically, am I using it in my life? No, not really. I'm thinking what's the most likely outcome as opposed to what does my expectation.
I think to truly understand it, one then has to crack open after all the inserto, the technical inserto, which for me, it's like at least half of it I don't even understand. It's dense.
This is where VC is quite interesting because he says the probability of the loss needs to be judged in connection with the magnitude of the outcome. It's not the likelihood of an event that matters. It's the magnitude of the outcome in connection with the likelihood of the event.
Yes.
So when you have a VC investing, it's the magnitude of the potential outcome that's highly valuable, even if the probability is low, which is why he talks positively about it. But what's interesting is that he talks about learning from history. So history teaches us things that never happened before do happen. This is where he starts to introduce the black swan, and we can get into that another time. But the more information you have, the more confidence you can have, and therefore more justification you can give. And therefore, the more confidence, with more confidence, you're more likely to come up with a better answer or a better way of getting to an answer to get to a magnitude, like a high magnitude outcome. It's quite interesting.
I had a point just now I was going to talk about, which was, so I've noticed we've mentioned a lot about relating everything to startups, VC, whatever. Which sure, it's our space, but all these ideas can be applied to one's personal life as well. So if we rewind a little bit, you're talking about asymmetric bets or the whole notion of randomness, which once Naval had actually consumed Incerto several times. He had this really cool tweet, which if you're watching, we'll throw up on the screen. I'm going to try and recall some of it now off the top of my head, but not all of it. But Naval says things like, move to a big city, go on lots of first dates. Before I continue on the others, why those two specifically? Because in your personal life, if you're looking to find a suitable mate, life partner, spouse, if you're in a big city like, let's say, London or New York, there's more randomness and there's more chance of you coming across someone that's a potential life partner. He also says go to more cocktail parties. Or why does he say go on lots of first dates? Well, lots of first dates, you eventually find the right life partner. He says tweet more. We tweet. The tweets that I think about, there's some tweets where I'm like, yeah, this tweet's gonna bang. Spend 10 minutes on the tweet, typing it perfect. But this is the one. And I DM Iman and a couple of friends like this, please. It's gonna blow up. The tweet, nothing really happens. But the ones where I just have some thought and I'm like, whatever, just quickly tweet, send it out. Don't care. And then after I've sent it, I'm like, probably get 3 likes, but don't care. And then you open Twitter, it's suddenly got like 60 likes, 100 likes, who knows, whatever. And people are DMing you and cool things are happening. It's the ones you never thought of, which is the whole notion of the asymmetric bet, which we go back to. But there are many examples of this, which is Naval says write a book, start a podcast, blog, invest in startups. These are all things where the downside is capped again. And you are opening up to randomness and chance, to that variance, which it comes down to actually a lot of luck, a lot of inexplainable. It's randomness, and so we're underestimating the effects of randomness and can't actually comprehend and should do more of those things.
That's exactly right. That is so. When he talks about skewness and asymmetry, chapter 6, that's exactly what he means. It's like and I think so. There's a couple of connective parts here.
You're starting to twitch. There's too many ideas.
No. There's actually
in our thought.
I'm thinking non-linearly. So there's a couple of things. The first thing is we're going to get onto heuristics in a second, which is what he borrows from Kahneman and Tversky from their famous book Thinking Fast and Slow. But the second thing is this point around potential payoff times probability impacting the skewness point. Religion comes to mind. Now, I know you've spoken about before. You've spoken a lot about before. Like he's written these specific articles that talk about religion separately.
A research paper, yeah.
Yeah, proper research papers. What he terms here in this book is called Pascal's wager. Mm-hmm. And he says it's optimal for humans to believe in God, right? Because the upside, the magnitude of the potential outcome, even if the probability is tiny, the upside is tremendous if God exists. Yes. The downside of you being a Muslim, a Christian, or any Abrahamic religion or whatever religion,
Zoroastrian, how dare you? Any
of those, the downside in terms of living that life is quite small. Why? This is going to get into the heuristics points, which we'll talk about in more detail later. The things, and the Lindy effect as well, the things that you learn from heuristics are not like world-changing stuff.
Correct.
It's stuff that's been passed through history and stood the test of time, and therefore makes decision-making for you simpler and faster. Yep. Right? So you don't have to go through the fallible human problems that we have around assessing every potential thing, engaging our emotional systems to make a decision, which is this whole point around type 1 and type 2 thinking, which, Kahneman talks about. But actually, you've got an answer very quickly. And that enables you to live life at a faster pace. And it means that you're more likely to live a life that is a better sample path, because it's probably already gone through some form of Monte Carlo analysis and gotten to a better outcome on the basis of ergodicity. The other thing is, one more thing. Mm-hmm. When I was at university, we studied, obviously, like the political philosophy part of my degree. We studied a lot about, different writers. And one of them, who's super famous, Machiavelli, the Prince. What Machiavelli talks about that is very close to what's brought up in this book is the or I think he specifically mentions Machiavellian luck. This point around virtue versus fortuna. Having the skill, the hard work, all of that stuff that, for example, Munger mentions or Naval mentions is great, but actually fortuna, luck, plays more than a 50% role. So if you have the right heuristics in place, you're stacking the deck in your favor.
Yes.
Because you're able to rely on history insofar as where it has been useful to get to a better outcome. And therefore, if you put the hard work and effort and intelligence and whatever, all of that stuff in as well, you're far more likely to live a life that's less mimetic, that's more likely to lead to a good outcome.
Sure. But even then, still not yet guaranteed.
Correct. Nothing is guaranteed.
Nothing is guaranteed.
Right. Should we take a break?
Let's take a pee break because I've had 2 coffees, a lot of water, kombucha, many other. So pee break time and we'll be back. Right. Back from the pee break. And I think we've actually covered a lot of the ideas, but what we normally do, which we haven't done much of in this episode, is just relate to a lot of our own stories and just have fun with it. But it's a unique type of book. Again, as I said, these are foundational to our brand. Before we get into some more stories, let's just, some stories. You want to cover chapter 7 and then we go to 10 and 11, just some of the ideas, and then we slowly go into just our own stories relating to all these ideas.
Agreed. I mean, look, I'll keep this brief. Chapter 7 is about induction. So what's the problem with induction? This is really interesting because he starts to talk about black swans, which then he brings into his other books, in his other book. But he says no amount of white swans can allow the inference that all swans are white. Black swans exist, even grey swans exist, man. But the point is that from an observation of a single black swan, you'll know that you can refute the claim. But until you've seen the black swan, you can't, irrefutably refute the claim, if that makes sense. But so he talks about over-reliance on data here a lot, which is quite interesting.
Data can be used to disprove a proposition, but never to prove one.
Exactly.
And, maximizing the probability of winning does not maximize the expected value from the game.
Correct. Do not be over-reliant on data, because historical data doesn't necessarily indicate what your risk exposure going forward is going to look like. I think that's the only thing that we really wanted to bring out from chapter 7. There's different types of theories as well. He doesn't like theories. He says that theories can never be right because they've not been tested, right? This is this whole Monte Carlo fallacy. And then he obviously talks about Pascal's wager, which we've touched on, talking about God. So what should we move on to next? Let's
move on to part 2 of the book, which includes chapter 10 and 11. And he does actually mention several parts, especially early on in the book, the importance of chapter 11. So let's quickly touch on 10, then we'll touch on 11, and then we'll just have some fun with all of the ideas.
So the second part of the book is called that Monkeys on Typewriters. And chapter 10 specifically, what does he talk about? What's this chaos theory that he brings
Losers take all, the non-linearities of life. So chaos theory is this notion that small inputs can lead to a disproportionate response, and chance events coupled with positive feedback will determine economic superiority, not and edge in expertise. So, our brain is not cut out for non-linearities, basically, which is, we've already touched on some of this, but I think no matter how much we try and consume all this information, it's almost impossible.
Yeah. So what he means, I think, by chaos theory is he specifically says too much success is the enemy.
Yep.
Too much failure is demoralizing. I would like neither. It's not about having the middle ground. It's like, I just don't want either.
Yes.
Either.
Yeah.
So you don't want to get fooled by randomness yourself if both things happen too much.
You mean most of the VC and startup market?
Chucks. All right, look, let's get to chapter 11, which is where the real juicy and actually the most complicated part, in my view, the most complicated part of the book
and
is.
Important.
Correct.
Okay, so chapter 11, randomness and our mind. We are probability blind. So how do you want to kick this one off? Okay.
It's the one bit that I don't really know where to start. So the major thing is this is where he really starts bringing in Kahneman and Tversky.
Yes.
And different modes of thinking.
And he was, by the way, he was firing shots at Steven Pinker even back then.
It's quite interesting.
A real one.
I mean, he holds himself to account. Like you could tell him that. I mean, you can see that that's what he's been talking about his whole life. But look, I made some notes here that I think I want to raise. He talks about the brain using different modules to think, and those modules can have an impact in the way that you think, because we have, as historically psychologists have spoken about 3 types of brains: the reptilian brain, the limbic system, which is your mammalian brain, which is similar to other mammals, and then the neocortex, the cognitive brain, which is actually what differentiates us from monkeys. And I found this interesting because what he's essentially doing is he talks about, I've written here, what we touched on earlier, the need for emotions in decision making. And how he calls it, I think he calls it the lubricants of reason. So you can't, if you've created a computer that had to make loads of decisions, it would have to go through infinite data to be able to make a very simple decision. Whereas emotionally, a human can use that as a shortcut. And this is where the heuristics come in.
And it's people overvaluing their knowledge and underestimating their probability of being wrong. As you say, the confidence interval matters more than the expected value. So we feel emotions, then we find an explanation. So, I mean, I was susceptible to this. I mean, we all are, but I was susceptible to this even more so a few years ago, especially before coming across a lot of these ideas, whereby I tried to make decisions as rationally as possible. It's like there's a meme among us, which is after in Farsi, which is after all this due diligence, and then you have a fucking suboptimal outcome.
So let me explain what the after all this due diligence comes from. Basically, I think it'd been like 4 months since our group, so that's Cyrus and I and a couple of other friends, including Ali Carpet, GOAT.
Ali Carpet is basically he's Fat Tony, basically, from Taleb's work, but continue.
He's called Ali Carpet for numerous reasons. I'm sure your imagination can support you in figuring out why. We'd met up after a long time, and during that time, you had gone and done some mad research into the different types of cigars that you wanted to smoke.
We both had. We come across some content with Davidoff London, Kirby Allison, etc., Max Fawkes, but yeah.
And
Loza of Sauter Cigars, shout out. Some fine cigar establishments in London.
Probably the best in the world, to be honest. We had come to the conclusion, and I think this was my fault, to be honest, because this is the one I really wanted to smoke.
Yeah.
It was a specific type of H. Upmann cigar. I think it was a Churchill one. And if you don't know, H. Upmann is a Cuban brand named after a German entrepreneur who I think went into Cuba and set up his own brand. H. Upmann cigars are fucking strong. And we went to, where did we go? It was the Bulgari Lounge.
Edward Sahakian Lounge, which is in the Bulgari Hotel in Knightsbridge.
We went there, we had cigars inside. I had mine, absolutely loved it. I finished yours, I think. And I was like, fucking hell, I'm not feeling great. Like this is a very hefty, strong cigar.
Because they also had no filtration system in that cigar lounge, completely box room.
That's what he says, but actually they have the best filtration lounge in London. Technically, yeah. And then we come out of the cigar lounge and we're like, where's Cyrus? And we have a look around, he's not around. And we're like, what the hell's going on? And we just see him crouched over, all floors on the floor.
Nah, that's tabloid. That did not happen. That definitely did not happen. But I wasn't feeling well.
He was not feeling well, to put it lightly.
I think it was the blood sugar levels, some levels of something had the cranku, something had happened. And combined with maybe an espresso martini, which was not a good time to have, in a box room with basically 40 bros and Cubans, which, at this point we'd like to think, we're cigar connoisseurs, and this has never ever happened in any other occasion. But on that one occasion, I was absolutely screwed. And so the joke was, we got in the car, and our friend Arya, @who's Arya, who writes on Substack as well, he said to me in front of everyone, he's elite troll, he said, after all this due diligence, and this is the outcome. So what were we talking about at the point before this due diligence, which is, it was about emotional decisions in chapter 11, which is, I used to do all of this due diligence on, just in life, right? Even career moves and other things, all this due diligence. But then you still get a suboptimal outcome because you have not taken into account your emotions.
So this is System 1 and System 2 thinking comes into play here. So Kahneman and Tversky in that famous book of theirs talk about System 1 being quick, automatic, effortless, very, very associative thinking, immediately making a decision. and system 2 being slow, deliberative, deductive, controlled reasoning, right? So you in that scenario had gone through this long ass system 2 process of trying to figure out what the hell you wanted to smoke after
Indeed.
reading a million reviews and just figuring it out. And then when we get there, instead of choosing I like Romeo and Julieta, or I like a Davidoff, or you know what you like,
Sure.
you went for one of the strongest cigars on the market, and after all this due diligence, he died.
To be honest, the System 1 is an example. Probably listening to this, good friend now, Joshua Owen, I met in Tbilisi, Georgia, and we went to the Davidoff Cigar Lounge, and I just said to the Georgian guy, I'll have that one. That Davidoff looks cool. And it was one of the best ones I've ever had. So System 1 thinking for the win. Okay. So what else in this chapter?
I like the idea of satisficing in this chapter. So
this is a topic which I have nerded out about a lot over the last few years, because I'm always reading Morgan Housel touches on a lot of these ideas, especially in Psychology of Money, a lot of his blog posts. Jack Rains, who's a guest we've had on the podcast, he writes at youngmoney.co. A lot of these financial writers actually talk about satisficing a lot, and sort of this question of when is enough. And so satisficing is, Taleb talks about you stop when you get you get a near satisfactory solution. It is an adequate result, but not the optimal one. And so
let me read what he quotes. So he talks about the first thinker who figured satisficing out was Herbert Simon, an interesting fellow in intellectual history. He then goes to explain, this guy was a computer scientist, philosopher, whatever, at Carnegie Mellon CMU, which is obviously one of the best places to study that specific course. And he says satisficing was his idea. You stop when you get a near satisfactory solution. Otherwise, it may take you an eternity to reach the smallest conclusion or perform the smallest act. We are therefore rational, but in a limited way, boundedly rational. He believed that our brains were a large optimizing machine that had built-in rules to stop somewhere. Not quite so, perhaps. It may not be just a rough approximation. He then talks about Kahneman and Tversky. But the point that's really interesting is I see this a lot in you, in that all this due diligence, you are naturally inclined to want to understand both pros and cons of everything and want to go through a long list of figuring out what the hell is the optimal solution. But much like these mics that were a pain in the ass to set up, actually, if we just stuck, if you try to just get to an optimal solution regardless of something, just stop at some point. And where this is, final thing I'll say is, where this is super useful in my life is when you're doing work and you have to think through a first principles lens.
First principles?
Yeah, literally first principles. That's a private joke where Cyrus can't say the word principles.
HR, we have someone racist.
Bullying.
Immigrant's gonna immigrant.
Thank God we don't have a HR department.
Immigrant's gonna immigrant. You lost your train of thought.
No, I haven't. I'm just done with this guy. First principles thinking. This is absolutely key. And even Elon Musk talks about this when he's interviewed about this. The poster child for first principles thinking.
Which we have a video on our YouTube channel you did, which is phenomenal. People should go check out
how Elon Musk thinks.
But please continue.
The very important thing is you could come up with a series of 1 million hypotheses to test any problem and get to a solution for. The key is optimizing the number of hypotheses you come up with and being very quick and iterative in the way that you go through them. This area of satisficing is so important in life. People need to take this on board.
All right.
Especially you.
I could talk about this for hours, but...
Wait, one more thing. My sticker.
All right. You got a story.
Don't suffer imagined troubles. Seneca.
Chuck's snippet.
Do not fucking overdo everything and think of every fucking potential outcome and put yourself in this hole and go down this fucking rabbit hole of trying to figure everything out.
Yep.
Just fucking do it, man.
So to an extent, but yeah, I get your points. Bad horse. But yeah, you know this, as you just mentioned. Years ago, I was much worse with this, where everything's a super analyzed, aiming for optimization kind of decision. And I've improved. I definitely still have improvement to do. But someone who springs to mind is Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss, maybe Derek Sivers, these kind of people, but let's use Tim Ferriss as an example. Who phenomenal guy, phenomenal content,
brilliant.
Hats off to what a goat in content creation and podcasting. But
And angel investing.
But of course, we keep it real, so we say what we think, which is rather than most people who keep the ideas to themselves. He's a goat of podcasting and content and angel investing, but he is not necessarily a person who I'd like to emulate in that in his, I don't know how old he is, maybe his mid-40s now, 45 or something, in that he is not married and doesn't have children. And even to this day, a lot of the podcasts he records are about optimizing this. He even has the soundbite in his intro, optimize or something. So that's not a life that I want to live. And so when I'm observant of other people and observant of myself and my past decisions, taking into account a lot more, it's literally the midwit meme of gut instinct as well.
I can't believe you brought up midwit meme.
Which is the low IQ's like, my gran did it, feels right, I'll do it. And then the guy in the middle is just over analysis, mental model optimization, optimize. And then the high IQ is just like, yeah, my gran did it as well. And it's just like the same thing. So it's a classic case of, gut instinct, emotions, of course, are important. And let's go. Say your point, because I still haven't gone to satisficing, which I haven't.
Hold on. This is exactly the point of why he can't figure out satisficing, because he still hasn't gotten to the fucking point. Sorry. The thing I wanted to say was Tim Ferriss. We'll come on to this later in the sort of prescriptions we give on the basis of this book. But Tim Ferriss specifically is very stoic in that he understands. Tim Ferriss talks about the fact that he's acutely aware of these as being issues.
Yes.
So he is self-aware and therefore stoic and understanding of where he needs to make the improvements. If he doesn't choose to make those improvements, fair play. Like, the guy is aware of it. That's what I love about him.
Sure. Okay. But the other day he just released the podcast episode on optimization again. So
I'm not involved.
But again, he's a goat of podcasting, angel, etc. But again, it's just an example. But satisficing, which is a point that I wanted to touch on, and this is where it's the other type of optionality, where optionality is a bad thing. And so there was a famous Harvard Business Review blog post of some sort, or online article years ago, which was about the dangers of this. People who go to, let's say, 2 years of consulting or whatever, and then they go to Harvard MBA to then go to IB associate or something, or VC. And the whole point of this is they're trying to keep their options open, their paths open. They're not really like doubling down on one thing or burning the boats. Same thing with, I was explaining this to you the other day, the problems of finding a suitable life partner in today's environment is optionality. Jack Rains has written about this again on his Young Money blog, which is just endless optionality. So you find someone who's suitable, but then you're still thinking, but again, overthinking, but this is the one most important decision of life. What about all of these other attributes or traits, or this other characteristic, or this other person has this better thing, or they're a bit more intelligent, or maybe they look a bit better, or yada, yada, the list goes on. The point is, a lot of this just comes back to simplicity, right? It's living a simple life. It's living a not necessarily a shitty life. We're not saying necessarily you get the point that I'm trying to get at, which is, let's say you're for example, we'll go back to the life partner thing. You're dating someone, you align on core values, but then the rest you're like, okay, I could let that go. They're all minor things. As Luke Burgess posted the other day, the adaptability of people change, your kids will change, your wife will change. It's the adaptability that matters. And there's also just a few of the core values. Or in the case of a career, you just pick one thing and you're like, all right, I know that as Aaron Clarey, Arsehole Consulting says, every job sucks. You just pick one thing, you double down on it, and then, okay, you could take asymmetric bets on the side as side projects, do a little podcast, do a little blog, do whatever. But the point is, you pick one thing, you stick to it. You of course use rationality to a degree, and then you're also using emotion to a degree, but then you're sticking to your guns with one thing and then doubling down, which is something I'm trying to remind myself more and more of don't fucking it's a disease, this whole endless optimizing and having a lot of optionality, which is not a good thing in today's world. Where as last thing I'll say, which as Naval says, take a shot. He says today's problems are a problem of abundance, not a problem of scarcity.
So this is where, okay, so heuristics come into play here a lot. So he starts to list all of the different heuristics, which we'll come on to in a second. But on that point, what's interesting is the emotional decision making that humans have is what we tend to do without realizing is we'll feel an emotion about something and then create the explanation that explains the decision we made on the basis of emotion. So on that point around over optimizing, like sometimes all you need to do is just follow your not follow your passion, because I know that's like anti-Cal Newport and kind of different to what we say. I won't go down that rabbit hole. But what's interesting is emotion is actually the core driver of why you're making a decision. So typically, don't try to, with the benefit of hindsight, try to change something. Go with your decision first. It's the confidence with which you make the decision that is more important than the expected value that comes from that decision if it's not being post-rationalized.
Agreed.
All right, look, before we get into the heuristics, a couple of things that I just want to mention that we don't pass through quickly. Normative versus positive is the first thing. Mm-hmm. So he talks about midway through this chapter, normative thinking is like considering how things should be. Positive thinking is considering how things actually are. He gives an example, which he says... say you get a windfall profit of $1 million. The next month you lose $300,000. You adjust to a given wealth. So the following loss would hurt you emotionally, something that would not have taken place if you received the net amount of $700,000 in one block, or better, two sums of $350,000 each. In addition, it's easier for your brain to detect differences rather than absolutes.
I'll give a great example of this. In recent weeks, the whole OpenAI shit show happened where Sam Altman was kicked out and then obviously came back later on. But during that it was a few days sort of drama where he was kicked out, and you saw extremely well-respected VCs like Vinod Khosla, who's like considered one of the goats of Silicon Valley. He was going on Twitter. He was losing his mind, kind of tweeting things in a way which he would never tweet before.
Slavery does not decrease with wealth.
NNT. But Vinod Khosla was tweeting things like, has his account been hacked? Why is he so emotional? Why is he tweeting like this? Or just weird things, right? And then So the point is, you were talking about normative versus positive. There's so many thoughts in my mind. Like, so fucking excited over this episode. It's like a million things mixing. Okay, normative versus positive. So Vinod Khosla was losing his mind, but as you're saying in the example of someone who's $1 million net worth, and then they lose 300, they make $1 million, but then they lose 300, and then because they've lost 300, it kind of they feel like everyone around them has more. They also feel they should be happy, but they're not happy with their position because they've lost money relative to where they were. Same with Vinod Khosla. He's had endless wins in terms of his investments, but then the one investment goes a little wrong, or was going wrong in that moment, and he just goes batshit crazy and loses his mind. Which
hold on. To be fair to the guy, OpenAI is a generational company, and he saw his money going down the drain, and he was pissed.
He was pissed, but again, not to get too philosophical, but when you're his age, you've made it, right? What's in again, the classic saying, as I say, we are nothing but a fart in the wind in the cosmos of time. If you zoom out of all of this shit, realistic, much respect to Vinod Khosla and all the other big shot VCs, but who's going to remember Vinod Khosla like 500 years or 1,000 years from now? Probably no one.
Okay, so
no one. So who cares if he had one other investment of like in 1,000 years? They'll probably remember a few people from our generation, maybe like Steve Jobs.
I disagree with this. I think you're being fooled by randomness. Okay, no. I think the way in which history is recorded has changed over the last couple hundred years, and so now there are going to be a lot more micro histories around specific individuals, and therefore they're more likely to be remembered as a result of just an abundance of information.
I disagree. I understand the volume of recording has increased, but the form is just a different form. Before it would have been a written form. or it would have. I mean, it was basically just written form, right? That's all it would have been, or initially word of mouth, then written form.
All right, but then what about?
But now it's like, okay, it's digitally recorded. Okay, hoo-ha.
Yeah, but this is the other thing is, if you can train an LLM to figure out each individual, actually you'll have a Stoic in your pocket, or you'll have a Vinod in your pocket for the rest of time.
Realistically, I don't think anyone will give a fuck about Vinod Khosla or any VC for that matter 1,000 years from now.
We're not hating on Vinod.
We're not hating on Vinod. We're showing an example. Or like, okay, people will definitely remember Charlie Munger. Not necessarily because of the amount of wealth he had accrued. Of course, that contributed to some of the respect he gained and the platform he gained, but more so because of the wisdom. Why were we all so affected and saddened by the passing of Charlie Munger? Because we never spoke of his wealth. We spoke about the wisdom that he left us with. And so 1,000 years from now, they'll, I hope, be talking about Taleb because of the wisdom he's given us, and he'll leave the world. And so really going back to the whole point of, I don't really think anyone gives a fuck about these VCs. Like, to lose your mind, normative versus positive thinking, which Taleb discusses in chapter 11, who cares? Like, Vinod or any VC shouldn't be losing their minds over one thing if they've had immense levels of success, and this one will just make bank balance go, I don't know, 2 billion to, okay, 4 billion, even if it 2x's. But me and you, let's take a step back. We discussed the other day how we think so much of all these people in business and all the people in business, media, startups, tech, whatever. They're just mentally diseased. And
on that point, sorry, I'm just going to take, so in this, across this book, from chapter 1 all the way to the end, Taleb makes a point of calling out journalists because he doesn't think, well, actually in the beginning he talks about historians becoming journalists as well, which is quite a negative thing. But he makes this exact point with relevance to journalists actually being entertainers and not providing you insight that's valuable because they don't understand the concept of causality and whatever. But anyway, continue.
This is the thing.
All right, okay, stop talking.
I lose my train of thought.
Okay, let's get.
So I think the point.
Wait, let's get back to. So we were talking about normative versus positive. We've talked about system 1 and 2 thinking, which is brought up in this book. The final thing, which is relevant to what you just said, is this point around signal and noise.
Yep.
So how do you determine, therefore, what is signal and what is noise across a whole bunch of information, particularly as information is increasing and we're becoming more and more intertwined with it?
There are 3 points, right? 3 points I want to touch on as a summary of this signal and noise, which is significance. And these are statistical terms, of course, but significance, which is determining, is something, is it meaningful or important? And then causality, determining if there is a cause and effect, which often is confused with correlation. And then lastly, the confidence level, determining the reliability of a statistical conclusion.
So he talks about something called perfect noise, which is basically complete bullshit. And he says, how do I decide that it was perfect noise? Take a simple analogy. If you engage in a mountain bicycle race with a friend across Siberia, just side note, Taleb loves cycling. He has a friend who is a cyclist on Twitter that he asks questions about all the time. Anyway, if you engage in a mountain bicycle race with a friend across Siberia and a month later beat him by 1 single second, you clearly cannot quite boast that you are faster than him. You might have been helped by something, or it can just be plain randomness, nothing else. That second is not itself significant, etc., etc. I would not write in my pre-bedtime diary, cyclist A is better than cyclist B because he is fed with spinach, whereas cyclist B has a diet rich in tofu. The reason I'm making this inference is because he beat him by 1.3 seconds in a 3,000-mile race. Should the difference be 1 week, then I can start identifying things. So you have to clearly understand what significance means in the context of any specific situation like this.
Yes.
And then there's the point around causality, which he goes on to talk about. Like, this is a great example because I've seen it happen so much in media. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. It is the consequence because it came after. Say hospital A delivered 52% boys and hospital B delivered the same year only 48% boys. Would you try to give the explanation that you had a boy because it was delivered in hospital A? Obviously not. Like that is where causality and correlation get mixed up. Should we move on to then the final thing, which is the takeaway from, I think, most of the book really is this point around heuristics and the different sort of, I think, 5 heuristics he talks about.
Yes. So again, before we get into the heuristics, I think this one episode will not do this book any justice. We'll have to redo this episode because it's so foundational to our brand again and again in the future. But the heuristics, one is anchoring. which is comparison to a given reference. So if you have any examples of that, you can share, and then I can elaborate on that from what he spoke of in the book. You may have some highlights there.
Yeah, let me find them. So,
If not, then I'll go on to... So I'll read the heuristics quickly, and then we'll dive into them. So anchoring is one, and then you have availability as a heuristic, which is estimating the frequency of an event according to the ease with which the event can be recalled. Then you have representativeness, which is gauge the probability that a person belongs to a particular social group by assessing how similar their characteristics are to the typical group member. Then another heuristic is simulation, the ease of mentally undoing an event and playing the alternative scenarios. And finally, we have affect, which is the emotions elicited by events determine their probability in your mind.
So anchoring, for example, is that we've already spoken about it. It's the comparative thing, right? So if you lose if you make $1 million but lose 300,000, it's a far worse situation.
You're anchored to the million, yes.
Correct. Estimating the frequency of event according to the ease with which the event can be recalled is this availability point. This is quite interesting. It's because it's relevant to humans because we tend to not build... This is what I took away from it. We tend to not build foundations of knowledge that then you build up on over time and can therefore dip into that knowledge pool at any given time. What we tend to do is just take the last year's knowledge build because we are short-term thinkers naturally, and therefore that determines what our thoughts are at the time, which is this whole thing around what System 1 actually truly means and System 2.
It's kind of interesting what I heard Mark Andreessen say, which is he only consumes content which is either from the last 24 hours or from more than 20 years ago or something, the whole Lindy effect, which is he's kind of ignoring everything in between. Or let's ignore Mark Andreessen, let's talk about Taleb himself. He says, if you read a newspaper from a year ago, you'll realize how it's pointless just reading the news generally. I mean, he has a whole thing on against reading the news and how it's all complete bullshit because read the newspaper from a year ago today, you realize... why the fuck did I even bother? So
he talks about this a lot at the beginning of the book as well, not just in this chapter.
Yes.
Where he's like, fucking hell, like, why are you asking me about how the market's going to move? Or he talks about it in this chapter, why does Bloomberg say the market moved 0.01%? Like, that is just noise. I do not care. Like, why are you giving me it's where explanations are given by journalists, which really irks him. It's
actually on this exact chapter and the previous signal and noise part of chapter 11 you were talking about, but also linked to these heuristics, which he says, look only at the large percentage changes. Unless something moves by more than its usual daily percentage change, the event is deemed to be noise. Again, linking to this point as well.
And the final point, so we've talked about heuristics, we've talked about all of these different system 1, 2 thinking, normative versus positive, emotional decisions, all of that stuff. The final point that brings it home for me is he talks about age and statistics, right? I say here, very interesting example where he talks about conditional versus unconditional life expectancy. He specifically says, a fallacy that I saw commonly made by a prominent TV financial guru goes as follows. The average American is expected to live 73 years. Therefore, if you're 68, you can expect to live 5 more years, and you should plan accordingly. She went into precise prescriptions of how the person should invest for a 5 more years horizon. Now, what if you're 80? Is your life expectancy minus 7 years? What these journalists confuse is the unconditional and conditional life expectancy, right? It's quite interesting. And so if you're 73 and you're in good health, you may still have, say, 9 years in expectation, but the expectation would change at 82. You will have another 5 years, provided, of course, you're still alive. Even someone 100 years old still has a positive life expectation. This is really interesting. TV financial planners may confuse a few people. This is quite harmless. What is far more worrying is the supply of information by non-professionals to professionals. It is to the journalists that we turn next. He then goes on a tirade about these guys, but it's the point around unconditional versus conditional thinking, which kind of brings this chapter to a close because it's able to give you a view of what is the probability of an event occurring and what is the probability of that event occurring irrespective of any other event. So you need to be able to think in a way that is completely relative and also completely devoid of relativity, which I found very, very interesting and something that I'd never thought about. He then talks about like joint probabilities and stuff, which is mathematics, or statistical stuff that we shouldn't probably go into. But I think that's the most interesting thing that he talks about in the book.
So that's chapter 11. To wrap up part 2. And part 3 is called Wax in My Ears. Part 3 is really more, we can touch on things like, stoicism and skepticism, and he has ideas around gamblers, ticks, and pigeons in a box.
Yeah.
So I think that, as he said himself, the most important chapter is really 11. And I feel like 11 does bring together a lot of the ideas from what we discussed earlier anyway. But yeah, how do you want to... I know I actually read this on Kindle, which in the future copies I'll be reading paperback, but Kindle I was highlighting and then it sends the notes to Readwise.
So section 3, Wax in My Ears, the really interesting thing is you go through this book reading into two things. The first is he gives you all of this lovely information and he starts ripping on people like journalists and shitty bankers and traders. But the other thing is you kind of get to a point of depression where you're like, what the fuck? Like, I've made all these mistakes. I'm a fucking idiot. You're making me feel like shit. What the fuck do I do? So instead of offering what he hates, i.e. prescriptions, he's trying to teach you how to call out BS and see these things through a lens of skepticism. So beliefs are path dependent if the sequence of ideas is such that the first one dominates, right? So this is basically talking about, interesting, he talks about George Soros here, but I won't go into that detail. He talks about building path dependence with the way that you think and using skepticism in a way to make sure that you're never thinking about something from a certainty aspect. The other bucket of stuff he talks about is stoicism, which is interesting because it's very, very,
Just sorry, on that point before you even get into stoicism, I think this whole chapter, rather than... We've pretty much gone through the ideas of the book. Again, we'll have to redo this episode again and again with improved understanding. But I think that's most of it. Now, part 3 is, yes, stoicism, skepticism, etc. But let's touch on, for example, with skepticism, giving examples of our own case. Every time we've read this book, and more so with the recent reread as well, as I said, you'll find yourself, I'll find myself scrolling Twitter or LinkedIn, and now much more skeptical of also everything we read. Almost everything I see now on LinkedIn is it's bullshit, it's horseshit. Like, after reading this book again, you're just like, it's all bullshit. Same with Twitter. People just saying, I did this and you could do this and I did that. And
but hold on. You are that is way too skeptical. We're not suggesting you do this because that is ultra skeptical. And you lose, what you lose in that is the potential to win on the potential high value.
But what I'm saying is I'm not saying extreme skepticism to the point of you're missing out on opportunities. It's skepticism, right, with stoicism, right, with awareness of luck and variance and placing asymmetric bets and all the other ideas in the book. But yes, one should not be solely extreme skepticism to the point that you're missing out on opportunities, because then that's also not, without getting too sort of the EAC movement, one is not optimistic enough. And so...
Explain EAC for those.
EAC is effective accelerationism. I suppose most people listening to this would probably have heard of it. It's a Silicon Valley movement where it's all about let's build the future's bright based on all technology and kind of, as the name suggests, effective accelerationism. But yeah, point is, you then want to balance this all with... So let's, I guess, put away all of this stuff now. Let's put away the books and the notes and stuff.
Wait, before we... We're not trying to be prescriptive here, but it would be useful to give a view of what he thinks a market
That's
fall
what I'm
does.
getting on. That's what I want to... Market fall, which we'll get on, and also how can one... Because the whole point of this pod is using Lindy Ideas, which is this book, and how one can apply it to business and life. And so, to be honest, some of the things that one can apply is... It's difficult, sure, but... reading more stoicism and then trying to apply those ideas and being aware of those ideas. Now, again, humans are not rational, they're emotional. So regardless of what events take place, humans are not going to be stoic. So maybe something like, if you have close friends, family, get them on board, or at least get one or two people around you on board as a sort of accountability measure of stoicism. For example, with you and I, some bullshit would happen. Let's say, for example, you'd say, so let's say hypothetically, you'd complain about something like, oh, this happened, this is bullshit, what bad luck, wherever. Maybe in the heat of the moment, the emotion takes over And then I'm around you because we've studied this stuff. And then I'm like, no, I'm observing you. This is just, it's this random event that happened. It's luck. Let's apply a Stoic lens to it. Remember that Stoic thing you read? Remember this from Meditations, Marcus Aurelius? Remember this stuff? Then you bring some semblance to it. Then you add some Stoicism to it as well. If you don't have people around you, then it's tough. I guess the nature of the world today is there are not many people maybe seeking such information. But if you're someone who's listening to this podcast, you should have people, at least one or two around you. If not, then seek those people through, if you're meeting the right people on Twitter, tweeting properly, replying to people, etc. We've made Twitter friends as well. You can find the right communities.
So a couple of things on that. Being complete. So given the elements we spoke about around emotional thinking, in that in fact we are emotional creatures, and you cannot be ultra stoic insofar as completely removing emotion from your decision making. Emotion is valuable. So if you are overreacting, I think is where you provide stoicism, just to add that caveat.
Yes.
The second thing is, from reading a lot of René Girard and mimetic theory, particularly from Luke Burgess in the book Wanting, when we had him on the podcast. Check out that episode. What you find is that there is an element of catharsis in going through an emotional reaction. So actually forcing yourself to experience the pain and or the overreaction enables you to essentially mourn it and put it to the side. That's really interesting because it does two things. It enables you to get over the thing and move quickly forward and essentially put aside the emotional stuff. But secondly, it makes you more stoic, because once that's been buried and mourned and gone, you're able to then think more clearly the next time that happens, as long as you're able to learn from those experiences. I think we don't do that. We do that a lot. But I think you need that, particularly in venture and startup land, because it's all about iteration and moving on and doing things quickly and learning from them. I suppose having a level of system one installed in your, first principles thinking that you apply.
And then I guess just the last thing to add to all of this discussion in the part 3, which is kind of more recommendations of how one can handle such events or to prevent such biases, is the Skinner box he talks about, which is kind of our bias to immediately establish a causal link. And so if one is working on self-awareness, or, even simple practices like, I'm not talking about becoming a monk, but even 10 or 15 minutes meditation a day, or some other practice of journaling or whatever, of becoming observant of oneself, then you can spot your own BS as well when you're alone. You could say, because this is why, again, scrolling LinkedIn or Twitter, I see something, and then for a second, my mimetic thing is like, let me message him on and say we should build something similar in that niche. It's going to take off, and then or whatever. And then firstly, I become aware of the bias, and of course, having read,
he's never aware of the bias. He sends me the messages anyway.
Always. Let's build $1 trillion company. But then, I become aware immediately of my bias to not establish a causal link. Not to say because this happened, that means we could also do that, and then that will also happen, get the same result. So it's really just working on self-awareness, being more observant of oneself, having the people around you where you can call BS and also bring you back down to level of, I guess, neutrality, and also studying the Stoicism stuff. And generally, all of this goes back to what Munger and Taleb, like, to wrap up this whole part that I've been talking about. It's what Munger and Taleb talk about, or Munger talks about, acquisition of wisdom is a moral duty. The more you learn, it's so cliche, but it's so trite, but the more you learn, the more you kind of start having, you could say, extra eyes to spot all of this stuff, or whether it's of yourself or those around you, to prevent or at least mitigate the effects of such events.
He calls something, I don't know if it's in this book or another book I read, epistemic humility, which he talks about embracing humility around what you know and what you can predict, right? So always hold yourself accountable to the knowledge that you think you've acquired versus what your typical biases are going to be. That makes you more rational. And also understand that, I love this because there's a snippet of Taleb, I think on Channel 4 News or Newsnight, Newsnight is a British BBC show, which comes after the news.
It's on Newsnight, yeah, I remember.
It's after the news at 10. It comes on this show, Newsnight, and this is decades ago. Taleb's on there with a full head of hair, if I remember correctly. And he's debating policy development and why actually we don't understand the complexity of systems enough to actually attribute something to have made a difference. In reality, economists just chat shit is what he says, and he calls out the economists on the screen right there.
Chat shit, get banged.
Literally chat shit, get banged. It's quite funny. So he has this ability to practice this epistemic humility because he is aware of the fact that the systems that we're trying to impact are so overly complex that in reality, the causal link is probably not there. Having an awareness of that is important.
All right. Would you say we've wrapped a lot of this up? And now the closing part of the show, which is really, we have a bunch of favorite quotes from the book. We also have our own relevant stories. We can now riff on all of this. Again, for the 50 millionth time, we will be redoing these episodes because every reread, you just pick up more and more. These are books to be studied and reread for life, basically, as often as you can. So what are some of your favorite quotes? I guess I'll start with...
Why did you ask the question if you're going to start?
I know, I can't contain the excitement. So let's see, there's so many. I mean...
Can I start with what it starts with in the book?
You start.
So we started this podcast with a quote about Croesus, who was the richest man in Lydia at the time, which was one of the city-states in Greece. And he was obviously captured by Cyrus the Great, which I think was Cyrus II, right? But anyway, I love that what he does is he talks about the capacity for beauty and how that's been diminished over time to get to the nub of a point. So actually, something we haven't spoken about is he specifically says throughout the book that he is a fool for randomness himself, particularly when beauty is involved. That's why he loves poetry. By the way, that's why Iranians love poetry, and it's so important to them, is because they loved being fooled by the randomness of it.
Yes.
Because it's beautiful.
Yeah.
We are creatures of aestheticism. We love rounded, lovely stories. We love beautiful things. We like beautiful, shiny things, which kind of explains capitalism in and of itself. But I love that it mentions the benevolence of Cyrus's decision to spare Croesus's life, but hinting to that fact, in that quote I say, that you've been fooled by the beauty of the story. That story probably didn't fucking happen, or multiple things across that timeline didn't happen together. So that's beautiful because he's like written it in such a nice way, and he's also touched on the fact that he himself is likely and has been fooled by randomness.
Indeed. I guess another quote... There's so many here. I mean, we kind of touched on this, but the road from $16 million to $1 million is not as pleasant as the one from $0 to $1 million.
100%.
In addition, John, which we mentioned earlier from one of the chapters, John is full of shame because he had lost it. He'd gone from 16 to $1 million. John is full of shame. He still worries about running into old friends on the streets. And I guess a lot of Taleb's ideas he talks about, Munger talks about this too, avoiding destruction, avoiding being wiped out, right? You kind of don't want to be... You don't take risks that just completely wipe you out. Share the
honestly, it's just... A lot of this book was me just thinking about my own experiences, but also your experiences when you were in banking.
Yeah.
Which, unfortunately...
I'm not involved.
He was, in my opinion, a much more valuable member of society back then.
Really? Because I was a charlatan at Silicon Valley Bank. Iman's been dying like 60 times today, just peeing himself.
In chapter 1, what he also talks about is, you remember we talked about Nero?
Yeah.
So the good, essentially, trader. He talks about Nero not fitting into the corporate lingo sphere. He says, business people who talk in full sentences, which literally made me crack up laughing.
Fucking hell.
Do you know when people send emails?
Fucking hell.
When people send emails where they're like... Good afternoon. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. Please see below for the list of actions following the meeting. All you could have done was, things to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But because we're like forced to go through this process, someone like Nero doesn't do that. That's number one.
Yep.
he talks about him not fitting into the corporate lingo sphere when he got hot and worked for an investment houses and so decided to go into hiding and then prop trading, whatever. It reminds me of a common story of you.
I know something funny is coming up. I know it's funny.
It reminds me of a common story of an inability to, this is what I've written, reminds me of a common story of an inability to assimilate to corporate culture. Reminds me of Cyrus banking too. The reason this is important is because culturally, and I'm 99% sure the reason Taleb is the way he is
Born in
partially
Lebanon,
correct.
immigrant.
Exactly. Raised in war, born in Lebanon, trade, like no bullshit job in trading. Like all of these things mean that it makes it very difficult for you to culturally assimilate to something that isn't what you know is true.
You should be a therapist.
Down the line, that's
we
coming.
normally do say some of these episodes sounds like therapy for me, but that's so true because, me born in Iran, born in post-revolution Iran, and then living there for 5 years before moving to England, moving to London specifically, it's a trend I see among not just Iranians, but immigrants, especially from the Middle East, who have been subject to areas of, let's say, turmoil or stress or whatever, and then you feel... As a kid, I studied some of this recently in terms of like psychology and child psychology. I guess the child brain, especially in the first 8 years of key development, you feel that you've been rejected from that environment, and then you've been put into this bullshit environment. You're like, the weather's shit, the people are weird, the food's shit.
But everyone knows that it's bullshit, and yet they still play along. This is what I find fascinating.
And so I've seen a growing trend where immigrants, especially Middle Eastern or Iranian immigrants, really, really struggle to report into anyone, whether it's a corporate environment or just any work environment. And so many of them, out of principle, are just...
Ali Carpet.
They are a man of themselves. So Ali Carpet, our friend, who literally, if you read Taleb's other books, the character of Fat Tony comes up. But Ali Carpet, our dear friend, is basically Iranian Fat Tony. He's never worked a single day in his life for anyone else. And I studied with him at university. After university, he just since uni, he's been working for himself, basically. And so your point is, elite point. What else have you got from all the... Because I know that when you were reading this book, you got all these sticky notes, and the sticky notes relate to stories to do with us or close friends.
Yeah, so the other one is in chapter 3, a mathematical meditation on history.
You just throw them at me. You just serve it.
This one is so good. So he is an underrated writer. Now, when you go and read reviews about this book online, for example, people will say... fucking hell, what's going on here? Great concepts, but it's such a hard book to follow because this guy writes so weirdly. And me and you, when we're reading this, like half the time I'm like, bruv, I'm so fucking confused. He's going off a million tangents. This is the beauty of how Taleb writes. He does a brilliant description of a US-based Soviet mathematician who resembles, in essence, Rasputin. Mm-hmm. So he's playing on these like themes of how he thinks Americans think of, post-Soviet or pre-Soviet people. And he even links it to the Unabomber at one point, which is like, genuinely, if you wrote like that today, you'd be cancelled. But because it's Taleb, he's able to say these things. And then he juxtaposes that with the description of the Monte Carlo man, mastering odds and of the betting. And like Monte Carlo in your mind conjures up like, like lovely suits.
Black tie.
Like rich, luxury cars, all of that good stuff. So what he's doing is he's saying that actually the value sits in the middle. So he goes through all of these fucking weird descriptions, and you're like, bro, what the hell's going on? My head's about to explode from all the different things and examples this guy's using. And then suddenly everything clicks. That is so rare to find in a writer, which I absolutely loved. The other thing, which was super, super interesting, the point is, I love this. You know how Iranian parents always gas about maths and physics?
Yes.
Right? All immigrant parents. He talks about something which I wish I could have put in front of my parents when I was like 7 or 8 years old. Yeah. He says, mathematics is not native for most. Experimentation of shooting bullets and randomly... So he talks about this example of like shooting bullets and uniform distribution. He says maths for the sake of maths is like bullshit.
Yeah.
It has to be applied to real life.
Yes. Of course.
I
Applied
would have not
mathematics.
gone through all that stress of Kumon maths and all that shit, bruv, that gave me
Kumon.
fucking problems growing up with opening a fucking equation on my laptop. Genuinely,
Genuinely.
legit.
legit.
I love that. That was one of my favorite quotes.
I like our minds are not quite designed to understand how the world works, but rather to get out of trouble rapidly and have progeny. If they were made for us to understand things, then we would have a machine in it that would run the past history as in a VCR with a correct chronology, and it would slow us down to much that we would have trouble operating.
So VCR, basically the old things that you used to put into fucking VCR readers, you would screw it back and forth for it to go back and forth to the beginning. I love that. That's this point around chronology.
Your favorite one was, a mistake is not something to be determined after the fact, but in the light of the information until that point.
Stop looking back at shit that's happened and say, oh, we made these mistakes that led to Afghanistan dropping, or to, this or that political
Even
thing.
in your own business.
He talks about Afghanistan specifically in the book, but even in your own business, stop trying to attribute specific reasons to shit when in reality we don't know, bruv. Like, only take what you knew up until... This is what we do. When we make decisions, we're like, up until this point, all the information that we have means that this is the most rational decision. Buying these mics was one of those things. So don't look back after the fact and say, actually, it was a shit idea making that decision. It was the right idea to do, as long as you're sane and rational up until that point.
This is exactly in the world of startups. A lot of founders would beat themselves up, and the opportunity cost of that time and energy is huge. The fact that a founder will beat themselves up of, fuck, why did I make this suboptimal decision? Our burn has increased, runway has decreased. We're going to have to fire people. It's going to be bad publicity, yada, yada, yada. But how they could actually think about it is why it's so fucking important that every founder reads this book 100 times, is that founder in that moment should think, actually, which is true in most cases, if you're an intellectual and skilled and hardworking founder, you'd say, actually, going back to that point in time, with the information I had, it felt like it was the right decision. And if I ran a fucking Monte Carlo simulator and I kept that decision the same, but I changed some other random variable that is out of my control that I haven't even thought of, it's random in the world, then the outcome would have been positive and very different. And so founders should be fucking reading this book and applying this lens a million times.
100%. I could not agree with you.
Going back to, this quote was so good, I'll say it again, just for all you founders and VCs and charlatans as well. Founders are not charlatans, but some of them are, but most founders are not charlatans, but most VCs are charlatans. A mistake is not something to be determined after the fucking fact, but in the light of the information until that point. Chucks.
The next thing, which is super, super interesting. I love this because genuinely, it made me question my, early career choices. You wait and see.
But congratulations to Iman Olia. Yesterday was his final day of slavery in the corporate world after 8 years. Slavery does not decrease with wealth. NNT. Chucks.
NNT is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, if you are unaware. Some business speeches belong to this category in their own right, except that they are less elegant and draw on a different type of vocabulary than the literary ones. We can randomly construct a speech imitating that of your chief executive officer to ensure whether what he is saying has value or if it is merely dressed up nonsense from someone who is lucky to be put there.
Yep.
How? You select randomly
this is good.
5 phrases below.
This is so good.
And connect them by adding the minimum required to construct a grammatically sound speech. Then he lists a series of things. These are so funny.
So,
wait.
Oh, go on. I didn't know.
We look after our customers' interests, the road ahead. Our assets are our people, creation of shareholder value. Our vision, our expertise lies in, we provide interactive solutions. We position ourselves in this market. How we serve our customers, short-term, long-term, courage and determination. We play for strength, commitment to excellence, strategic plan, our worth ethics. Honestly, I wrote here, this is fucking brilliant. Look for a new job. Although, and then I said, although, this could be construed as valuable signals that you're playing ball with the market. A lot of this is games. Like, by saying all of these things, you're making your business appear like a better value, like a rationally run business that people will put money into. That's the other thing that's quite interesting here.
This is actually why I think a lot of because if you're one to build a VC-backed company, with the aim of making it an enormous company, like let's say an Uber or Airbnb someday. Once you IPO and then you're at the mercy of the market and shareholders and board members and whatnot, you've basically lost the company long ago. And then you're going to have to be a company that abides by this type of bullshit, which is why people should follow we need the Elon Musks and the deep tech founders of the world. I'm talking about non-deep tech, non-real tech. But if you're just doing another fucking software startup, you should be following, or any other startup, which is not deep tech, following a Taleb or Daniel Vassallo model, which is you keep your freedom and independence, and you don't have to throw about all these fucking bullshit buzzwords, and you can say whatever you want that is on your mind. Just like, let's go back, because we'd fucking written this one. It's one of my favorite points. We keep saying slavery does not decrease with wealth. Where does this even come from? All right. So a while back, and I think we said this on another episode in the past, but it's an important piece. I think Jamie Dimon had made some remarks. You can add, fillers here where I'm missing context, but Jamie Dimon had said something about...
Who's Jamie Dimon?
CEO of JP Morgan, aka Slave Factory.
Seen as probably the greatest banker of our generation for various reasons, but continue.
Correct. And he had made some comments about China, and there was so much pressure on him after some time that he had to publicly apologize to China, to the CCP, right? And then what happened is Taleb had said something, maybe in a translation of one of his books into Chinese, or something was misconstrued, taken out of context or whatever. And they said that this is probably some BS journalist that said, hey, Taleb, this is offensive to the Chinese. And so the difference between, and Taleb called out Jamie Dimon, we'll throw this tweet up on the screen if you're watching. Taleb fired shots at Jamie Dimon saying, you see, Jamie, you had to go out and apologize, despite Jamie Dimon being worth much more than Nassim Taleb. He said, you see, Jamie, you had to go out and apologize, but I don't have to apologize. Something along those lines. Slavery does not decrease with wealth, which is Jamie chose the same game as, let's say, the startup founder who wants to build a huge company, IPO, board members, yada, yada, shareholders, all that bullshit, versus Taleb, who made his FU money, or like Daniel Vassallo or an indie hacker or a SaaS founder or whatever, that just says, F all of this. It's going to be a 1 or 2 man show, keep complete autonomy and independence. And then that's it. That's basically, you're not susceptible to all this bullshit buzzwords that you have to say, like innovation, disruption. MBA is the master of being average.
He hates MBAs in this book as well, I should add, which also aligns with our values.
And I guess just to wrap up on that whole point, we're not saying don't start ambitious companies. In fact, I actually do like some ideas from this EAC movement, because they're all about building world-changing tech companies, startup companies, specifically more deep tech, hard tech, etc. And the first ever article I wrote, which kind of was kickstarted Rational VC, was Tech Markets Are Irrational. You can still find deep on our articles page if you go looking. Those startups should exist, and we need more of those. But the other majority of startups that are created are just BS. You don't need to go seek funding and do all of this bullshit and then be giving to. So whenever I see now, come to this conference, watch this founder talk, and then they post a summary. Here are the top 5 takeaways from ex-CEO who gave a talk here at Web Summit or at fucking Slush or whatever bullshit. What are these events called? What was the event recently in Finland? Slush, whatever bullshit. Web Summit, Slush, yeah. It's like, I don't want to listen to that founder. They don't know. It's all BS, basically.
No, it's not. If the founder, no. If the founder is acutely, this is the point I was raising with Tim Ferriss, if they can say that what they've done has been in large part delivered through luck, as well as the other things. If
in
they
that
are
case,
stoic,
yes, but none of them do, which is why I say it's mostly BS.
Okay, let's agree to disagree. There's another quote here that's quite interesting. I fucking love this quote. When I was in the employment of the New York office of a large investment house, I was subjected on occasions to the harrying weekly discussion meeting, which gathered most professionals of the New York trading room. I do not conceal that I was not fond of such gatherings, and not only because they cut into my gym time. While the meeting included traders, that is, people who are judged on their numerical performance, it was mostly a forum for salespeople. and the category of entertainers called Wall Street economists or strategists, who make pronouncements on the fate of the market but do not engage in any form of risk-taking, thus having their success dependent on rhetoric rather than actual testable facts. That's exactly what you're talking about. It's an offshoot of what you're talking about, which is people that are just unaware of... They don't have skin in the game, which is another book we'll come to soon, but also they're unaware of the fact that luck plays a major role in these things. And also just made me crack up because he talked about the gym stuff, which is literally us. Like, if I had to sit in one of those meetings again, I'd struggle, bruv.
I mean, the very few people who get out again, which is why, despite some of his BS doings, I said earlier, I give some props to Chamath because he's acknowledged his luck. But my beef is with the majority of people who get on these stages or these platforms and talk their nonsense, and then this prescriptive drivel that's regurgitated by others to say, these are the top 5 things that you can do like so-and-so. Or the founder says, this is how we reached product market fit. Like, okay, it's that doesn't necessarily... If there are some core principles, like Sam Altman in YC Startup School years ago gave a talk on the foundational principles, sure. But these founders getting up in these conferences are not discussing the foundational principles of PMF. They're talking about, this is how I got to PMF.
And this is how
you can also get to PMF, which is no fucking different to any guru course seller online saying, follow my crypto strategy.
He gives an example which is very, very relevant here. He talks about bullish versus bearish and why bullish versus bearish is made up crap. So for those that understand, bullish is like you are positive about the direction of a market, for example, and bearish is you don't think it's going to move in a positive direction. Accordingly, bullish or bearish are terms used by people who do not engage in practicing uncertainty, like the television commentators or those who have no experience in handling risk. Alas, investors and businesses are not paid in probabilities, they are paid in dollars. Accordingly, it is not how likely an event is to happen that matters, it is how much is made when it happens that should be the consideration. He goes on to basically just hate on commentators and chief strategists and all this stuff. But this is exactly your point, which is when they create prescriptions, what they're really doing is creating an entertainment thing. They're trying to get people hooked.
It's the whole TikTokification of the world today, which is...
Or any social media
Any
platform.
social media, which is just give me the fucking short term. I don't care about millionth time going back to Munger in every annual meeting. I mean, he'd talk about why no one copied their whole, not necessarily investing strategy, but just the principles, the foundations of that strategy, which is simplicity and keep doing what works. And he says, because no one wants to get rich slow, for example. No one wants to. And a lot of this, again, all these ideas tie together. Mimetic desire. Luke Burgess wanting, go read that, because a lot of the Rene Girard ideas he talks about. Why the fuck would I want to get rich slow when so-and-so on Instagram is flexing with a Lamborghini and a private jet? I want that.
Facts.
Facts on facts. But yeah, I think this has been the... Do we have much more to add before we start to wrap up?
I have so many notes.
Because I have endless quotes and notes, but then the whole point is if someone listens to a longer than 3 hour or 2 hour pod on the ideas of a book...
Yeah, they might as well just read the fucking
book. They could listen to you. But then again, our interpretation, and this is authentic content creation, people would listen to it for a lot of that, right? And how we apply that to VC startups' life.
I'll make you a bet.
Trucks.
The bet is that as soon as someone hears your voice, they're going to press exit.
I wouldn't be surprised. I'd be more shocked if they keep it on. Let's watch the retention of the show.
The expected outcome is very high because both the probability and the payoff of that is high.
Shucks.
So what are your sort of closing thoughts? Any closing thoughts you have?
Closing thoughts are...
Evidently not.
Required life reading, as I said before, extremely profound. Reread. We're going to keep redoing probably, I don't know, episode 100 or 150 or 120 or whenever. In a few dozen episodes, we're going to redo the Incerto series and Poor Charlie's Almanac in between all the other Lindy books that we're going to be doing. Because they're foundational to our brand and this required life reading. If I were to only read if I could only pick 6 books and I'm on a deserted island for the rest of my life, it would be the Incerto plus Poor Charlie's Almanac. But we're going to do a whole bunch of other books, but the next episode is also going to be probably Black Swan, the next in the Incerto. But yeah, I'll caveat with we'll redo it with improved understanding over time as well.
couple of things. If you want to help us, given that we don't charge any money for anything, we take serious time out of our busy schedules to read these books, come up with these thoughts, and go through all of this, and set up all of this. Everything is done internally. So if you really want to help us, subscribe to our newsletter.
rationalvc.com is where you can subscribe. You can check out everything. And what you get for subscribing is early access to podcast episodes. And more importantly, sometimes you may not want to listen to the entire 2-3 hour podcast. So you get a summarized email of the learnings from the episode and how you can apply the ideas to business and life. These Lindy ideas from Lindy books that we're exploring every episode. So check that out.
And in addition, go onto Spotify, rate us 5 stars. That really, really helps us. And in addition, if you're watching this and you're a degenerate who loves YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, because it genuinely does help us get more visibility. As you know, with podcasts, visibility is tough. There's no algorithm on Spotify that pushes your podcast to others, or even on Apple. So help us on all platforms if you can, and we'd appreciate it.
Audio discoverability is a problem in the podcast land. So yeah, as Iman said, if you can hit 5 stars on Spotify if you've made it this far, and also hit the follow on Spotify, please. Those two help enormously for audio discoverability. And then, if, as he said, if you're a YouTube degenerate, you know what you need to do.
Thank you for repeating everything I just said.
I know, but I really wanted to hit the follow points, because following on Spotify is equally as important as the rating. But yes, I guess I was a parrot there. So anything else you want to say here?
I'm so sick and tired of you, man. I need to get out of this.
I don't blame you. I seriously don't blame you. But probably going to crack open another kombucha.
Also, just another... Look at his socks. Zoom into the socks. Show the shoes as well. Basically, not only does he love Taleb's books, he also dresses like Taleb. Go and have a look at what Taleb wears.
I mean, I've been dressing like this since banking days, or slightly prior. A lot of the influence.
You got offended.
I got really offended. I tried to say I had no drip. But it actually influenced quite a lot from my uncle, who'd lived in Europe for many decades, and he just has insane drip. Just insane drip. So, I mean, even the ideas, like how I have the leather briefcase with like the Chelsea boots, a lot of this stuff he was doing like 30 years ago, or like when I first moved to England, I saw him doing, and I always found really cool. So when I grew up, I kind of emulated a lot of his, I guess the first 8 years of your life, your brain is absorbing everything around it. So correct. I absorbed his fashion sense, which, what
a weird way to end this, but...
All right, time for some wild Alaskan salmon with some organic British carrots and a protein pouch yogurt. Cheers. See you on the next episode. Cheers.